Hi, I'm Shaniqua Levin with Every Child Matters, and I'm here with Pidot, who is running for Congress in the 3rd District. So Steve Israel is retiring, which leaves his seat vacant. So there are 3 people currently running for office, and Congressional Candidate Pidot has agreed to sit down with us to talk about children's issues. As you know, and with your experience and what we see, it's not very often that you guys get that platform to talk about children's issues. When they ask you questions, a lot of times it's around K to 12, but it doesn't necessarily address childcare, poverty, safe children, working families. So we want our members and our voters to know how you feel about those, so that way we can have them make their decision based on what a candidate feels about children's issues. I really do believe children are the future, and we want to just see who we should vote on, who's the best candidate for children. And the best way to do that is to find out where you stand on children's issues. But if no one's asking you, you may not get it out there. So one of the things we do encourage is, even beyond today, just share, your views and thoughts on children's issues, so that way people can know.
Sure.
So for those of you watching, we're gonna just let him speak a little bit about himself for 3 minutes, and then we'll ask a series of questions for, we'll answer them for 2 minutes each, and then we'll let him finish up again with just a closing about who he is as a person. And thank you for anyone that's tuning in, and thank you again for allowing us to go live on Facebook and not really knowing the questions beforehand. So that's very interesting, and I applaud you for doing that, because we really just want to know what you feel.
Right.
So we'll give you just a platform to speak a little bit about yourself for 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. And I really appreciate this forum. As you said, children's issues, family issues are extremely important. It's not always an area of the candidate's platform that we get to focus on, in such a singular fashion. And of course, kids are often the most neglected constituent in races like these. Of course, they don't vote, so it's easy to overlook folks who aren't actually pulling the lever. But as you said, it's a crucial policy area. It's one we need to focus on more. It's one I feel strongly about. I'm a father of 3 young boys. My wife and I have 3 sons, Charlie, Henry, and George. Charlie is 5, George turned 3 yesterday, and Henry is 7 months old. And I'm critically concerned for their future. It's one of the key reasons, if not the key reason, that I got into the race. I live here in Glen Cove, grew up here on the North Shore of Long Island, and the reason I got into the race originally was to fight against, a couple of things. The primary factor was to fight against the absolutely rampant corruption and waste that we see in our government, both locally and at the state level, and certainly at the federal level. And 2 is to return our policymaking to a more effective, pro-growth policy structure when we focus on economic and fiscal issues that I think, so this is an area that does get a lot of attention often, but I think people often underestimate the degree to which these kinds of policy choices and the real world impact from those choices do affect families and children. And so I'll save some of that for some of your questions, I think, but it is a really keen area of focus of mine in terms of how very high level things like tax policy, spending choices, allocation of resources, and even down to lower level things to do with labor policy and regulations do have real world impacts in terms of availability of jobs and real wages and take home pay and options and flexibility that parents and families struggle with, particularly in such a high cost of living area as New York and the surrounding regions. So that's a bit of background about me. I'd be happy to delve into whatever you'd like to ask.
All right, great. Having a panic attack about the volume, so let's just check to make sure it's on really quick. I'm pretty sure it is. Yes. Okay.
Great. We'll have to start from the top.
We'll let that. I know it was on. It was
Good,
so
good.
good. But I had that.
Right.
So thank you. All right. Those it's a lot about how you feel overall about children's issues. So I appreciate your thoughts and your feedback on just who you are as a person and what motivates you to get involved in this race. So thanks.
Sure.
One of the first questions that we have is 90% of a child's brain is developed by the age of 5, right? So if elected, what will you propose to invest in children ages 0 to 3 years old?
Well, I really like the idea of expanding access to early childhood education. I mean, I think we've been lucky enough to have our kids have access to that, and not all families do. I think we recognize, and this is something where I think there's sort of a broad bipartisan consensus, in fact, in this country, that education, the provision of quality education to all children, is an important necessity, because it serves, obviously, a public good. We need the next generation to be better educated than the last generation. They're going to be taking care of us in a few decades anyway, and obviously it's something that we all have a significant stake in. So I think expanding the access of availability of pre-K and even nursery to all children makes a lot of sense, because when kids then get into grade school, you find that they just have such a head start if they've been given some kind of a structured, meaningful, well-planned, well-executed early start on the foundation of their education going forward. So I think perhaps more than anything else, expanding that access, that provision of we call it education. It's not so much teaching kids math and state capitals at age 3 and 4 years old, but giving them those early building blocks such that when they do start to jump into that at 5 and 6 years old, teachers and administrators are not having to already play catch up. Okay, here are kids who are already lagging behind, and I think that causes a bit of the achievement gap we then see in later years, where you have kids coming in with such disparate starting points, even if they're 5, 6 years old.
Thank you for your feedback on that.
Yeah.
Yes. Our next question. Too many children in our country who are suffering from child abuse and maltreatment. If elected, how will you address this issue?
This is a hard issue, and I think especially for parents and parents of young kids, because it's almost unthinkable when we spend so much time worrying about the safety and welfare of our kids to imagine circumstances where kids are not being cared for properly, and not always simply because resources aren't available, but simply because they're in situations involving neglect or outright abuse. And it's heartbreaking, and I think there's probably not one single bullet answer, but I think a significant portion of the way to address this is through both enforcement and treatment options. I mean, so there are obviously laws in the books that are meant to protect children from truly egregious neglect and abuse, and I think too often the enforcement function that's supposed to oversee that, whether in child protective services or police law enforcement, are overstrained and insufficient. Two, I think
Insufficient and
insufficient availability of those resources for that enforcement and treatment. Two is, I think, going back to what I said initially about the sort of broader economic picture. I think the degree to which the health of the economy, the availability of good jobs, and rising real wages tends to correlate so strongly both with poverty levels and with all the ancillary disadvantages we see arising from poverty, whether it's drug use, whether it's incarceration, crime, and of course lack of achievement in schools, that if we return to a more robust economy, if we are able to get more jobs created, if we're able to lift real wages and lift literally millions of people out of poverty, we're going to, I think, prevent a lot of families, a lot of kids from going down a path that leads into situations involving neglect and abuse, substance abuse, and again, incarceration, and all the other patchwork of problems that often feed into this. So as I said at the beginning, I don't think there's a single bullet answer, but these are some of the areas that I think about in terms of how do we address what are the real root causes here that are driving some of these situations that I said as a parent are almost unthinkable, but they happen all too often.
Right. Now you said part of it was like the workforce, that you felt like creating more jobs. Like what would be one of the ways, if elected, that you would go about tackling that?
Right. So I think, and I'm a Republican. My economic and fiscal policies are driven by a belief that the private sector does best. The economic engine operates most efficiently and most strongly when we are encouraging business creation, small business creation. We're encouraging new job creation. We're encouraging real wages to grow. And I think that comes from lowering the tax burden, simplifying the tax burden, eliminating unnecessarily complicated regulatory burdens that we've seen so strongly here in New York have led to out-migration of jobs, of businesses large and small that are either closing up their doors entirely or saying, oh, we're going to create new jobs, we're going to do it in New Jersey and in Connecticut, or we're going to move out west, we're going to move overseas. And so I think a lot of the policies that we've adopted to try to encourage job creation, whether it's the state saying, okay, here's going to be a tax-free zone, here we're going to invest in this, pick these winners, these losers, and subsidize this and penalize that, all too often has the opposite effect. The more the government gets in and tries to sort of monkey with the economy, the more it creates problems. And of course, the more that apparatus grows and grows and grows and tries to control everything and introduces more opportunity for fraud, waste, and abuse and corruption, then of course, then also not only doesn't lead to any new jobs, but it leads to waste of resources that could be used for some of these other priorities we talked about, education, healthcare, whatever else it might be. The more we're wasting money on things that don't work, the less we have, the fewer resources we have for the priorities that matter.
Okay. What changes, if any, would you like to see pertaining to the Common Core initiative?
A lot of changes. I'm not a fan of the
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Let's see. I'll try to be brief. I think Common Core. A lot of people talk about the bad rollout or implementation. To me, there's a fundamental policy problem, an ideological problem in terms of what Common Core envisions in terms of education standards and how to improve outcomes and reduce costs. So I think as a general matter, the more we centralize the decision making, centralize the curriculum, whether it's in Albany or in Washington, having a few people, the ordained experts saying this is what kids need to know, this is how we're going to test them, this is how we're going to reward those that do well and punish those that do poorly. I think we do much better to the extent we can return decision making, whether it's in terms of development of curricula or how schools can be administered. The greater extent to which that's returned to the local level as possible, to local teachers, administrators, and parents who know best what the needs are of their kids, who know best how to gauge what's working and what's not, much better than a Scantron printout somewhere in Washington saying this school is good, this school is bad, this school is good, this school is bad, and you've got kids that are stressing out for a whole year over a standardized test, or as we see so much here on Long Island, opting out entirely, where in some cases we have over 50% opt-out rates. And I thought the worst problem recently is the education secretary said any schools who have over a certain opt-out rate we're going to deem in need of improvement, and that's going to ding your school budgets, it's going to ding your home values. So it actually punishes parents for opting out of a system they don't like. So I think we ought to, I'll give you just one specific before my 2 minutes go up, is I think we need to amend the Every Student Succeeds Act that has an anti-coercion clause that says the federal government can't coerce states into adopting Common Core. I think we need to add to the anti-coercion clause to say that the education secretary can't coerce parents into having their kids participate in the system if they find that it doesn't suit their needs. Okay.
And now just as part B of that question would be, now you said bring it down to the very local level. Now I just noticed there's a couple examples of that. On Long Island you have a district like, well, let's think about where we are. We have a district like Garden City, and then you have a district like Hempstead. So then that's example of like how it happens sometimes when things are at the local level. So how do we not have those differences at the local, if we do it the way you're proposing it at that local level?
No, it's a very good question, and we do still have that gap, that achievement gap, as you said, even from one district to another that might be neighboring and might look very similar in terms of socioeconomic status, availability of resources, local availability of talent for teachers and administrators. But I think that disparity, the achievement gap, comes less from having a lack of universally applied standards and more from having insufficiently comprehensive ability for schools to compete, for schools to innovate, for administrators to decide what's going to work in their district, and if there are teachers or administrators who aren't performing well, to ask them to move on to a different career or to reward those who are actually getting better results, and I think for an administrator to have more autonomy to say, okay, this teacher's program over here, it sort of diverges from what we tend to do typically. It's worked much better than everyone else, or this teacher's not doing what was planned and it's working more poorly. Let's go ahead and see if we can move more from what's not working to what is working. Let's reward those who are innovating and finding things that work better. Let's give them more money. I think to the extent teachers actually have an incentive, of course they have an incentive, that's why they got into the business, the line of work, is to help kids. But people are rational economic actors. To the extent school systems themselves, school board members, administrators, teachers have an incentive to innovate, to reduce costs, to compete with other options, whether they're charter schools, private schools, parochial schools, the more that we'll see all providers of education options working every day to find how can we do better, how can we cut costs, how can we improve outcomes.
And now something like that where you're rewarding those like that do well. Now would it be like school versus school? Like for instance Garden City versus Hempstead, or just within those schools themselves?
Oh, I think it could be both. I think the more competition and choice that you introduce, the better your outcomes become. More choice for parents obviously means they can select what works better for them. What works better for one family's children might not work for another family's children. But the idea of having competition within schools and among schools means that competition among schools means, I got to try harder to retain students, to retain talent, to retain administrators, because the school down the street is innovating better, keeping costs down better than I am. And within schools, certainly as well. It doesn't mean you have teachers, pulling each other's hair out, trying to grab for resources, but it means they're actually spending time thinking about their curriculum, thinking about what's worked for a student who was struggling last year and has suddenly sort of blossomed. What worked here? What can I try and introduce that'll expand that'll actually improve my outcomes here? And how can I do it without simply saying, hey, I need more money over here? Because in New York we spend more per student than any other state in the union, and yet we have at best middling outcomes. So I think it's proven not to be a problem that just throwing more money at it is going to solve it. It's cultivating that kind of innovation, and we cultivate innovation by increasing choice and increasing competition.
I would like to introduce Angelo.
Hi, Angelo. How are you?
You want to just tell a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
Definitely. So, Angelo Pinto, I work for an organization called the Correctional Association of New York. It's the only organization in the state, one of two organizations in the country that monitor prison conditions. So we monitor prison conditions in New York State. I don't monitor prison conditions at the CA, but I work on a campaign called Raise the Age. So New York is one of two states that automatically prosecute 16 and 17-year-olds as adults for any crime that they commit, which means they're automatically housed in adult jails and prisons. So I work on a statewide campaign to end that practice.
Right. Okay, great.
And I mean, I think part of what was exciting about coming to meet you today was to get your sense or perspective on, even in a broad take, criminal justice reform, and then even specifically with respect to youth justice issues.
Right. No, good question, and broad question. I'll try to offer a couple insights in terms of how I think about it. Specifically, and you mentioned the campaign you work on in terms of how to treat minors, and the idea of treating them automatically once they're sort of nearing majority as adults. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I was at a candidate forum a couple nights ago, and a question not about criminal justice, but about the age of legal majority came up, and I was saying something I think to a similar effect, which is that we have an age of legal majority in the United States, and that's 18. That's when you can vote. That's when you can go off to war and defend your country. And if we, for some reason, feel that we need to change the age of legal majority, whether it's for criminal justice or for any other reason, then we should have a discussion about changing it. But if 18 is the, admittedly at some point, arbitrary cutoff that we say that's when you've reached legal majority or a certain age of biological and mental maturity that we're going to treat you as an adult, then that's the age, right? So if there are specific circumstances and exceptional circumstances where a 17-and-a-half-year-old young man has committed a crime and the court finds it appropriate to try them as an adult, that's one thing. For the default to be 16 equals 18, it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. So I would certainly favor streamlining that again. If we're going to have 18 be the age of legal majority, that's when you're automatically tried as an adult, not 16, not 17.
Definitely. And how do you feel about, I guess, the kind of emphasis around criminal justice related issues now happening around the country? But I think even specifically in New York, are you an advocate for the reform? Do you feel like the criminal justice reform that's taking place is wise? I know a lot of folks cite kind of the cost benefits. What are your thoughts around that?
Sure. I mean, I can give you general thoughts. Was there specific criminal justice reform campaigns that you're talking about?
I mean, I think for me, one of the main focuses around youth justice. Not only young people prosecuted as adults and housed in adult facilities, which is something we talk about often, keeping young people out of adult jails and prisons, which is important, but also what happens to young people who end up in youth facilities and youth detention centers, and making sure those facilities are actually rehabilitating young people and not traumatizing them.
Right. No, and I think that's a very important guiding principle too, because again, these are children we're talking about, and wherever we draw the cutoff, and we say that if you're under that age, you're a child. Yes, even if we're talking about criminal infractions or if it's involves actual incarceration, the focus should clearly be on rehabilitation. This is not someone we're saying this is a career criminal, 50 years old, we're locking him up, and whether or not he gets out in 20 years, the idea is to keep this person away from society. That's never going to be the case, virtually never going to be the case when you're talking about a child. And one way or another, this child is going to be, back out as a member of society. We hope a productive, properly functioning member of society, whether it's in a month, whether it's in 5 years or 10 years. What's the public good here? I mean, it's easy to say what's the good here for the child, for the family. The objective there is to get the child rehabilitated, keep the child safe, get the child back out and becoming productive and happy and healthy. But in this case, it aligns perfectly well with the good of the public. When we're talking about this, we're talking about education, the public good, the public value of quality early childhood education. It's similar for criminal justice as it relates to children. So to the extent that reforms move us in that direction, move us more towards rehabilitation and not simply confinement, keeping young men and women, keeping children, boys and girls, away from society because they're a danger. They may in some cases truly be a danger, and they do need to be for a time kept separate while you figure out the path toward rehabilitation. But I would wholeheartedly agree that ought to be the focus is rehabilitation, and to the extent reform moves us in that direction, I think it's we're getting closer.
Definitely. And another follow-up question, kind of the intersection of criminal justice and education. So what's happening kind of around the country? Are you seeing more police officers in schools for a variety of reasons? How do you feel about that phenomenon, and do you think it's the most effective way for school safety to happen? I don't know that it's the most effective. I think obviously we need school safety is a concern that people are sort of exquisitely aware of, all too tragically. I'm not opposed to having police officers in schools, especially if it means when we have active shooter situations, you have an armed, fully trained, licensed, police officer there who can act on behalf of the state with all the powers endowed to a law enforcement officer to put a stop to that. So there are certain things I think that police officers are going to be able to do that no amount of non-police security personnel are going to be able to do, and you're not also running the risk of saying, we're going to go hire a security guard as cheaply as we can, and we want this person also to be armed to the teeth, because then you run the risk of introducing guns into the schools without the safeguard of knowing that they're in the hands of qualified police officers. So I can't say that I have a specific policy prescription in terms of what that sort of whole infrastructure of on-site security should look like, or the mix. But I'm not opposed to the idea of having police in schools, simply because of that that safety element when it does come to the true nightmare scenarios. Definitely.
let you think of some more while I jump onto the next. And feel free to any question that I ask, if you want to add a part B onto based on something you said or to inquire more, feel free to do that. Okay, so again, I'm coming from a nonpartisan, so if I'm not giving you feedback, it's just like this. That's why we want the viewers to make their own decisions based on what you said without me adding my little things in there. So is that right? So I just want you to know that. No okay. Okay, so what does childcare mean to you?
Good question. Childcare to me means a variety of things, but basically a comprehensive system of both safeguards, enrichment, and educational opportunities for children from birth through majority to gain those building blocks to be safe, to be healthy, to be cared for, and to receive the enrichment and development tools they need. So, I mean, in terms of a broad sense, healthcare is everything from, when I'm at home giving my kids a bath to if they're with a babysitter, if they're in school, if they're in actual daycare. So there couldn't be anything more critical in terms of what we as families, we as a society, we as individual parents need to focus on. I get the sense you might be gearing towards something more specific. If so, great. But if you just want sort of general ideas about child, it's the care and fulfillment of our most precious resource, and what could be more important for us to think about as we as parents do every minute of the day, but for us to think about as citizens, as voters, and as, in the case of political candidates, prospective policymakers.
Okay. If elected, is there anything that you would personally seek to do around childcare?
I don't have specific childcare reforms as part of the platform I've been running on, but as I've mentioned a couple of times, and one of my key focus is on pro-growth economic policies. I just see this as being so critical in terms of the spin-off side effect, not really even side effects, it's the results of having a sustainable pro-growth economic raising people. Maybe it's a color they want to.
I thought I could do not disturb.
But if we actually get back to where we were not that many years ago, we're actually adding new jobs sufficient to keep up with and outpace the growth of population, such that there's more demand for jobs than there are people seeking jobs. That's what actually raises real wages, raises standards of living, is able to enable families to keep up with the increases in cost of living. It increases the tax base. It enables the government to invest in real priorities, and it enables families to have choices about healthcare, choices about childcare, choices about where they're going to live and what they're going to do. So in terms of the way that childcare issues, family issues impact my thoughts on policy making, it more often than anything else, again, comes back to economic policy. How do we make it such that 10 years from now we're not having to worry as much about how do we combat the problem of drug abuse, how do we combat the problem of child abuse, how do we combat the problem of poverty? To the extent that we can prevent those bad outcomes from happening in the first place, we'll always still have them, but to the extent that we can minimize them, I think we do that through providing economic opportunity and the creation of new businesses, of new jobs, and the raising of real wages and take-home pay. I think that obviously strengthens our public institutions, it strengthens our businesses, it strengthens our families, it strengthens our farms, it strengthens our tax rolls, and everything that accrues from that. Lessens the degree to which we then find ourselves, painted into a corner, and how do we fix these growing problems? We actually start to see the tide turning on some of them.
And who would you say should have access to childcare?
Well, all children should have access to some manner of childcare, whether it's from their parents, others in their community, their teachers. teachers, other care providers. Certainly no child should be in a situation where they find themselves with gaps in or insufficient care.
And what do you mean? What do you mean by insufficient care? Because that they should have some form of care, but then there is insufficient care versus quality care. So do you feel that all children should have access to quality care, just some kind of care? So that we
no, all children should have access to quality care, for sure.
Okay. What have you done, either personally or professionally, to improve the lives of children?
Well, yeah, every day I try to improve the lives of 3 little children at home. But my career primarily has been in fraud investigation, fighting corruption, and financial services. So it actually doesn't have me interfacing with kids on a day-to-day basis, other than my own or at play dates or we try to be involved with our kids' school. But professionally, it's not been an area where I've had as much of an opportunity to, I think, have a direct impact on kids. It's something I very much look forward to in office, being able to see more tangibly and to have that kind of an impact, such that whether it's 5 years, 10 years from now, talking to my kids who will be that much older, that I'll be able to talk to them proudly about what I did during my time in public office.
What makes you the best candidate for kids?
I think I'm the only candidate who's going to improve economic opportunity for families. I think the other candidates in the race, I don't believe are focused on solutions that stand a great chance of improving the direction of our state and of our country. I think it's more a continuation of what's led us down a path of stagnation nationally and even regression here in New York State. What I want to get back to are policies that do encourage job creation, that do encourage new business creation and economic vitality, enable people to have more autonomy over their own pocketbooks, over their healthcare decisions, over their education decisions. And I think to the extent we can introduce more innovation, more competition into the education sector, to the extent we can actually get the economy growing again, have people wind up with more money in their pockets at the end of each pay period. Parents, schools, healthcare providers are going to be that much better equipped to provide kids with the services and resources they need.
If the minimum wage is increased, how would you help support privately owned or small child care centers meet the gap?
I think the best way, honestly, to help them meet the gap is not to raise it. I think that's one of the key concerns, is that especially drastic increases in the minimum wage like we've just seen passed here in New York do impact disproportionately employers of folks who are lower wage earners, and we see that in the education sector, we see it in retail, we usually see it across the board, but small businesses and employers of low income workers are hardest hit, because they see their employment costs, in some cases, well, raise it in minimum wage 70%, they're going to see a good portion of their workforce and the cost thereof increase similarly. So they're either going to move jobs out of the state, and so whatever kind of business or service it is that you had been using or had hoped to use might simply close, might move out of state, or might have to cut back on their staffing. So I think the best way to avoid that is to not go down a path where we have these radical increases in the minimum wage. It's obviously a well-meaning law, a well-meaning policy change, but one that very demonstrably, not only here in New York, but other cities and states, one state that's implemented such a large minimum wage increase, is exactly what businesses are saying we can't afford, either we can't afford the employees we have, we can't afford to create these new jobs that we're going to create, or we can't afford to live here anymore. We're going to go take this across state lines. So I think that as well-meaning as it is, it most directly hurts those it's intended to help. Are you better off? And the counter argument is often, are you better off making $8, $9, $10 versus $15? You can't live on $8 an hour. But you certainly can't live on $0 an hour. And I think that's what's overlooked in the in the sort of political posturing about it is people are sort of wear this badge of minimum wage increase as a really crusading for the little guy, for the impoverished, for the low income worker, kind of an ideal. But I think the real world impact that we see all too often is that it has exactly the opposite effect, and that's why I think it's so unfortunate, because people who are well meaning, including policymakers who are trying to do the right thing, push through things often, as was done here in New York in the middle of the night, that they haven't had a chance to either fully research or at least to look at the history of these kinds of policy changes and see what really happens.
So how would you propose that someone making minimum wage of $8 an hour be able to survive and take care of themselves? I'm not talking about someone with kids or anything, just like a single young person, not living home with family.
Yeah.
How would you propose that they...
I think the best opportunity for them is going to be for them to have better job prospects at the end of this year, at the end of next year, for their employer to be in a position to give them a raise or to promote them, or for, if they're not going to, for them to say after a year or two, well, I've developed a skill set here, I've done well, I'm going to go find another job that pays me better. And again, it comes back to this idea of economic growth and vitality, and implementing policy changes that support that. Because if we simply say we're going to raise the minimum wage from $8 to $15, $20, $50 an hour, whatever we want to raise it to, that's not going to cause people to create jobs. It will cause some people currently making that minimum wage to see their earnings go up. It's going to cause others making the minimum wage to see their earnings go to zero. And it's not going to create more jobs down the line. We know, we've seen, and the evidence is clear, it's going to cause jobs to disappear. So I think to that person making $8 an hour and unable to make ends meet, the best we can do for them is to try and create conditions that will encourage their real wages to go up next year, later this year, whatever it might be, that they either develop the skills to get that higher paying job, or their employer says, look, you're doing a great job and the economy is growing, we're getting more customers, we're going to add more people, we're going to raise your salary, we're going to raise your wages. I think that is the only, in fact, proven path out of poverty for millions of people, and it's unfortunately close to the opposite of the policy stance that we as a state and a country have been pursuing.
Okay. Do you have some other questions?
I think that's all for me.
Okay.
Well, we've talked to you about several of these children's issues, and I know it said it wasn't currently a part of your platform, but after hearing about some of these things, is there something that, if elected, that you would like to actively pursue or to take on it, to either make legislation or change legislation around a particular children's issue?
I'd have to get back to you in terms of other specifics. I mean, again, this is an area that is important to me and helps to drive and shape the way I think about public policy, and in particular economic policy, because again, I think that is what drives so many of these outcomes, so much of the achievement gap, the pay gap, that keeps people in poverty, that limits choice in education. I think that were we to actually get back on a pro-growth, prosperous footing, so many of these problems will be improved. But in terms of other specific, purely child care or children-focused reforms, I can simply pledge to you that I'll sit down and see if I can add a couple to the platform, and I'll follow up with you in the coming days if that works for you.
Great. I would love to.
Sure.
I would
I
love
do
to.
have one question.
Great.
Actually, I received a call from a mother today, and her son was charged with a crime and convicted when he was, a child. He was a young teenager, maybe 14, 15 years old, and he wasn't prosecuted as an adult. But she's, for years been dealing with the situation, and even most recently, she called me to tell me that she thought his records would be sealed. So after, his time served,
right.
he would be able to go out there and get employment, even get into school. And she fears that now. How do you feel about the sealing of records of children who, were prosecuted as children, but then, serve their time or what have you, and are trying to, like you said, even get employment or get education so they can get themselves back on track?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I certainly think it makes sense at least in some circumstances, where if you have a kid who's 14 years old, is not, we're talking about 16, 17, on the cusp of adulthood, who makes a mistake, should that follow them around for the rest of their lives and impact their ability to get a job, to get a loan, whatever it might be. And certainly in not all cases should the answer to that be yes. Now there would be other cases where a kid is older, might have a consistent record of problematic behavior, and that would be reasonable for an employer, say 2 years later, to know about. But in terms of if I don't know, obviously the particulars of the situation you're mentioning with this mother, but if they were to understand that the records were going to be sealed and then were later not to be, I mean, it sounds like there may have been, whether it was either a miscommunication or a change in policy, but it sounds like an unfortunate slip up, perhaps, if it's a 14-year-old kid that simply made a mistake, and it sounds like the kind of situation and circumstance where you hope this is not the kind of mistake that follows them around for the rest of their lives. So I certainly would be sympathetic to and agree with the idea that in cases like those, we want to be able to make sure that a young kid who makes a mistake does not have to pay for it for the rest of his life.
Definitely. Thank you.
I did have a couple other questions.
Sure.
You made me think of one. What do you think, or your thoughts about banning the box on job applications where you check off if you have been arrested or have been convicted of a crime? If I think it's like a felony or a misdemeanor.
Sometimes if it's just an arrest and then you weren't actually convicted of the crime, you still have to check off the box. That's why they consider ban the box that you
Right.
I mean, in terms of a general ideology, my thought is if an employer, a private employer and a prospective employee are meeting to try and decide if this is the right fit for them, I tend to default to the idea of the state shouldn't come in and say X, Y, or Z can't be part of this conversation. You can't ask this question. You can't ask that question. Obviously, we have certain personal questions and things that are clearly not relevant to prospective job performance that we don't allow to be asked. But when it comes to something like that, where it clearly could have an impact on job performance, job security, or whatever else might concern the employer, it seems to me that it's sufficiently potentially relevant that I'd be very hesitant to say the state should be able to come in and say, the two of you may not discuss that.
And then my final question, your thoughts on paid family leave. As you know, New York is adopted, but what do you think about it as for our country? What are your thoughts about paid family leave for our country?
Right. It's a difficult one for me to some extent, because I certainly see the benefit, and in our family we've benefited from leave policies from my wife's job, and so I think it's a great thing when an employer offers a generous and flexible leave package, whether it's for new childbirth, adoption, illness, military deployment. I think that's a fantastic thing, and I think all employers ought to offer it. But I think to the extent that we increase the mandate in the state or country telling employers you may not hire someone unless you offer a package of X, again can have the unintended consequence of making them less likely to create that next job. And that's where it worries me, is do you create something that's so burdensome that an employer says, we're thinking about adding a new job next year, we can almost make the numbers meet, but given this new burden, someone who may hire after 6 months, may be gone then for 3 months. And even if whether that's taken out from employer or employee side, taxes or disability insurance, simply the workplace disruption of it. Okay, we need to find a replacement for 3 months, then transition them back. Again, that's not to say that it doesn't make sense for most employers, for all employers, that they ought not implement something like that. I think that the extent to which that encourages top talent to come is tremendous, and that's why, from an employer's perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense to do it, because increasingly we do have working mothers and others with circumstances that would lead to them, needing or really benefiting from that kind of leave. But I think, for some employers that might be in a situation where it does impact the creation of that next job, that's where it worries me. And so that's why expanding the provision of leave via mandate by the government, I think, can be a double-edged sword at best, or outright damaging at worst, if it actually serves to constrain the job growth. Because then of course we don't have people working without leave options, but we have people who simply aren't working because the job wasn't created in the first place.
So then what do you think is the best way to balance the needs of the workers and employers when a worker has a child?
Well, I think it's to leave it primarily up to the employer and employee in terms of what the provisions for family leave are going to be, and because I think that is the policy posture that engenders the most job creation with the best terms and benefits, and again, because offering flexible and generous leave packages is, I think, for the most part in employers and employees' own interest, that we'll tend to see that still be the norm, to increasingly be the norm, in fact, as the flexibility and economic prosperity of both employer and employee improve. So I think, even as sort of non-intuitive as it might seem, the less that we sort of govern by mandate, again, by saying this kind of employer-employee relationship is legal. Not that it's improper or better or worse, it's illegal. You can't hire someone if even if they agree to come and not have a 12-week guaranteed leave after 6 months. For some employee that might work better for them. For some employer that might work better. So I think to the extent more of it is left up to those two private parties trying to reach a mutual contractual agreement, actually the better outcome. Employers, I think, when they have the capacity to do it, are going to say, yeah, we get better talent if we offer this flexibility, because more and more of our workforce is finding that they need it.
All right. Well, thank you again. I look forward to you taking a look at some children-related issues and to see, what possibly be part of your platform. Sure. And then also that if you are elected, then once you get in office, that we'd have another meeting with you.
Absolutely.
To talk about some current legislation and things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So I will give you just a last, closing minute to whatever you would like to let the public know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a good amount of the ground, but I just want to repeat that. I'm thinking about children's welfare, family welfare, how we lift people out of poverty, how we increase availability and choice and affordability and quality of things like education and healthcare services that are things that we as parents are consumed with every hour of the day. These are sort of the animating factors that both maybe want to get into this race and that will help to shape and govern how I think about different problems and decide what policy course I'm going to support. So again, for me, with the financial background broadly, it tends to center more on economic issues and how do we lift the country itself out of stagnation and in turn lift people out of poverty, create jobs, create opportunity, and create the availability of resources that we as individuals, as families, institutions, and government, country or state, can invest in those priorities that we all, I think, universally from both parties recognize are so critical, the provision of health and safety and success of the next generation.
Okay. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you.
For taking the time out
Absolutely.
to meet with us. Yes. This is Shaniqua. We'll be keeping this up on Facebook for about another hour, and then we'll take it down until we get a chance to have the other candidates also get the same opportunity. We're giving them about another 2 weeks. If there isn't any other response, we will post this up live again, and if there are other responses, we will post them up at the same time. So that way we'll keep it there on our Facebook page and on our website, so that way you can all make an educated decision once you go to the polls and vote for the candidate that is best for children. Again, this is Shaniqua Levin with Every Child Matters and Angela Pidot with New York Correctional Association. Thank you for watching, and remember, become an informed voter. When you see a candidate, ask them where they stand on children's issues. If you don't see them, call them, email them, have an in-person meeting, Facebook them, reach out to them. It's up to us to reach out to these candidates and see where they stand on children's issues. No one else is going to ask them. So it's up to each and every one of us. Thank you.